by Howard Brown, co-author of East Side Story, 1891 Murder Case of Carrie Brown. This podcast will focus on what I feel is a glaring black mark in the history of Manhattan's laudable newspaper reporting history. Manhattan has had an abundance of nationally recognized reporters dating back to the 19th century. Nellie Bly, Lincoln Steffens, Jacob Riis, and Arthur Brisbane, to name but a few, were all well respected for their contributions to further the field of journalism. Bly, Riis, and Steffens were noted for their reportage concerning society's failure to address social inequities and criminal behavior of those in positions of authority. During the last decade of the 19th century, the so-called newspaper wars kicked into high gear between William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer at the New York World. These two men practically invented what is known as yellow journalism. Ferociously competing against each other for the greatest number of subscribers, they provided their readership with stories that were far more than just a casual viewpoint and more often than not, bordered on sensationalism. The World, for instance, would get involved with murder cases, claiming on several occasions as having helped the police in an investigation. Retired NYPD Inspector and Superintendent of Police Thomas Burns was once quoted as saying that there were more good detectives among the press corps than in the average detective bureau, in an edition of the New York Tribune years after he had retired. With a pedigree such as this, it is remarkable that for over 123 years not one single reporter, editor, or magazine emanating from Manhattan saw fit to question the story presented by George Damon, the Cranford, New Jersey resident, who popped up out of the woodwork in early 1901 with alleged evidence, which led to the eventual release of Ameer Ben Ali, who had been convicted of the April 1891 murder of Carrie Brown at the East River Hotel in the Lower East Side. One would think that the Manhattan press would have carried the story before anyone. After all, Damon had been a fixture in the printing business on Beekman Street for decades, just a mile from the scene of the crime. The details of the Damon story took place in Cranford and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This is not to say that there weren't any newspapers that didn't criticize Damon's suspicious story. Suspicious in that he didn't simply mail the alleged hotel key along with the alleged bloody shirt left by the farmhand he'd hired to the police anonymously before the coroner's inquest, and certainly before the start of the trial in late June 1891. It's hard to fathom why Damon didn't think of this himself at the time, or at some point in time during the entire decade, while Ali was in one institution or the other. Criticism of Damon's decade-long delay in acting responsibly first appeared in print on May 23, 1901, in the Washington, D.C. Times-Herald. The contents of the first of the 4 affidavits that were submitted by Damon were examined without any critique of the long delay in coming forward. Articles appeared on the same day in Boston, Scranton, Brooklyn, Pittsburgh, Marion, Ohio, and Buffalo. The following day, on the 24th, the New York Times became the first Manhattan-based paper to mention the recent developments. On the 26th, the Washington, D.C. Times became the first newspaper to openly criticize Damon in an article titled, "Perverted Justice." It offered the opinion that as soon as Ali was released, the unnamed Damon should be put in jail for the same length of time Ali had served. For the remainder of the month, only 2 articles were found in American newspapers, both of which were in Buffalo. One was in German, the other in English. A full 10 days from the time the Washington newspaper reported on the events happening over 200 miles north of the capital on June 2, the New York Sun published an overview of the unfolding events. Unless my research is incorrect, there were less than a dozen newspaper articles during the entire month of June that tackled the story in Manhattan. Why had it taken so long for the press in Manhattan to cover the Damon story? For a newspaper like the New York Evening World to sit on its hands for 27 days before even mentioning this once. All-consuming, front page, crime story back in 1891, a crime story featured more frequently in the Evening World than any other Manhattan paper, was highly unusual. A brief paragraph on Governor Odell looking into the matter was found buried away on page 9, announcing that the governor of New York was in the process of looking into the matter. From April 24th of 1891 up until July 4th of that year, at least one article could be found somewhere in an American newspaper discussing either the murder of Carrie Brown or the Ali trial beginning in June. With the amount of time and of ink expended by Manhattan-based papers such as the World, Herald, Press, Telegraph, Evening Post, Sun, Evening World, Times, etc. on the case for 10 solid weeks, you'd expect at least one article from a reporter or an editorial questioning Damon's story. It is true that a decade had passed since Ali was sentenced to prison for life, and unlike other convicted murderers, had escaped the electric chair. Other important stories on other important events would replace the once compelling crime that dredged up the specter of Jack the Ripper in New York. For Damon's story to be true, this meant he lived for that entire period of time in control of the life of a man he knew was innocent based on him having the key and bloody shirt which could get him out of jail, and rather early at that, too. The latter item was apparently discarded, for it was not handed over to the DA in Manhattan in 1901. It meant that every day out of those 10 years Ali spent in prison, Damon was conscious of what he was doing by remaining on the sidelines. It meant that every day Damon could enjoy his home life and successful business. He knew Ali was sitting in a prison cell or in the insane asylum at Mattawan. It also meant that Damon was responsible for Ali nearly killing a man in Mattawan in 1898. In that year, inmate William Grief was assaulted by Ali, by the latter wielding a mallet and fracturing Grief's skull for an unknown offense. Had Ali not been in Mattawan, the assault would have never happened. Did Damon read the newspaper accounts in 1898 and realize his reticence in coming forward had been contributory to the assault? While one or two researchers may believe that Damon would have eventually come forward had Ali been given the death penalty on July 3, 1891, I beg to differ. Nothing in Damon's commentary on his reluctance indicates for a moment he had second thoughts on doing anything other than retaining the key and any other evidence he had that was left by his real or alleged farmhand in late April 1891. He gave a number of excuses for his silence, when one or two would suffice. Ali could have died in prison. Ali could have been murdered in prison. Had Ali been acquitted, he could have easily been jettisoned from the States to either France or his Algerian homeland, as he was not a citizen. Damon had every opportunity to come forward anonymously, as previously mentioned, but didn't. He may have even been lauded as a hero had he done so early on. He claimed the decision to withhold evidence had weighed on him right before he decided to turn the key in. But was that the real reason he came forward?